The railway that's redrawing the global energy map. Picture this. A freight train carrying thousands of oil barrels rolls out from Iran's Apron dry port, beginning an extraordinary journey. For the next 12 days, it will traverse desolate desert landscapes and sprawling plains, threading through some of the world's most strategically significant territory. When it finally crosses into China's Xinjiang border region, something remarkable will have occurred. An oil shipment will have traveled from the Middle East to Asia without a single warship protecting it, without passing through a single Western-controlled checkpoint, and without depending on the maritime corridors that have defined global energy trade for generations. This isn't science fiction. It's happening right now, and the United States is watching with growing alarm. What you're witnessing is the emergence of an entirely new energy transportation paradigm. One that bypasses the Strait of Malacca, avoids the Strait of Hormuz, and renders obsolete the network of naval choke points that Western powers have controlled for decades. For countries like Iran, which have spent years under crippling sanctions, this railway represents liberation. For China, the world's hungriest energy consumer, it's a lifeline that can't be cut by foreign navies. For the United States, it's a direct challenge to the architecture of power it has carefully constructed over 70 years. The China-Iran Railway is more than infrastructure. It's a statement about the future of global power, written in steel and concrete across the heart of Eurasia. Today, we're going to explore what this railway corridor truly means, not just for China and Iran, but for the entire international system. We'll examine how it works, why it matters, and whether there are still vulnerabilities that could undermine its operation. We'll look at the decades of planning that made this possible, the geopolitical earthquake it represents, and the future it's helping to build. If you're interested in understanding how the world's power structures are shifting beneath our feet, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our in-depth analysis of global affairs. Now, let's dive in. The old rules: how America controlled the flow of oil. For the better part of a century, global oil trade has functioned like an elaborate game of strategic chess, and the United States has held most of the powerful pieces on the board. Think about how oil moves around the world. Tankers departing from the Persian Gulf must navigate the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, where American and Allied warships maintain constant vigilance. Ships heading to East Asia from the Middle East or Africa must pass through the Strait of Malacca, a bottleneck connecting the Indian and Pacific Oceans, where the U.S. Navy projects power through its 7th Fleet. Vessels bound for Europe typically transit the Suez Canal, where American influence remains strong through its alliance with Egypt. These aren't merely geographic features. They're control points, strategic locations where the flow of energy can be monitored, regulated, or if necessary, interrupted. But America's dominance over global oil doesn't stop at maritime geography. There's another, perhaps even more powerful mechanism at work: the petrodollar system. Since the 1970s, virtually all international oil transactions have been conducted in U.S. dollars. This arrangement emerged from agreements between the United States and major oil producers, particularly Saudi Arabia, and it fundamentally reshaped global finance. When countries need to buy oil, they must first obtain dollars. When oil producers sell their product, they receive payment in dollars, which they then often recycle by purchasing American Treasury bonds or investing in dollar-denominated assets. This system grants Washington extraordinary leverage. Even when the United States isn't directly involved in a particular oil transaction between two other countries, it maintains influence through the dollar's role as the settlement currency. American financial institutions process these transactions. U.S. regulations govern them. And if Washington decides that a country should be cut off from the global oil market, it can weaponize this dollar-based infrastructure through sanctions, effectively blocking that nation's access to international energy trade. For decades, this arrangement seemed unshakable, but from Beijing's perspective, it has always represented an unacceptable vulnerability. China's energy dilemma. A superpower in chains. China's transformation over the past 40 years has been nothing short of extraordinary. From a largely agricultural economy in the 1980s, it has become the world's second largest economy and its manufacturing powerhouse. The factory of the world, as it's often called. But this industrial miracle comes with a massive appetite for energy. Today, China is the world's largest importer of crude oil, bringing in more than 550 million tons annually. That's roughly 11 million barrels every single day, enough to fill over 400 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And unlike the United States, Russia, or Saudi Arabia, China doesn't produce enough oil domestically to meet its needs. Its dependency on foreign oil exceeds 70%, meaning that without continuous imports, its economy would grind to a halt within weeks. Where does all this oil come from? Nearly half, 44.26% to be precise, comes from the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran collectively supply the energy that keeps China's factories running, its vehicles moving, and its people employed. Here's the problem. Almost every drop of that Middle Eastern oil reaches China by ship, traveling through waterways where American military power remains dominant. The typical journey looks like this. A tanker loads crude oil at a Persian Gulf terminal, passes through the Strait of Hormuz under the watchful eyes of U.S. naval forces stationed in Bahrain, crosses the Indian Ocean where the American Fifth Fleet operates, threads through the Strait of Malacca, another American sphere of influence, and finally reaches Chinese ports weeks later. At multiple points along this route, the United States or its allies could theoretically disrupt the flow. In peacetime, this seems unlikely. But in a crisis, say a military conflict over Taiwan, these maritime choke points could become pressure points, places where China's energy lifeline could be squeezed or even severed. Chinese strategic planners have studied this vulnerability for decades. They've read about how Japan's access to oil was cut off before World War II, strangling its war machine. They've observed how sanctions and naval blockades have been used as instruments of coercion throughout modern history. And they've concluded that as long as China's energy security depends entirely on sea routes controlled by a potential adversary, the country remains fundamentally vulnerable. The solution? Build alternatives that bypass the ocean entirely. The birth of an overland solution. China's quest for overland energy routes isn't new. For more than 20 years, Beijing has been investing heavily in pipelines, roads, and railways that could reduce its dependence on maritime transportation. The breakthrough came in 2013 when Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, an ambitious plan to recreate ancient Silk Road trade routes using modern infrastructure. The vision was expansive: highways, railways, ports, and digital networks spanning Asia, Africa, Europe, and beyond, all designed to facilitate trade and, crucially, give China alternative pathways for importing critical resources. Within this grand framework, the China-Iran Railway emerged as a key component. Unlike a pipeline, which can carry only oil or gas and requires years of construction across difficult terrain, a railway offers flexibility. It can transport oil, manufactured goods, raw materials, and people. It can be expanded, rerouted, and connected to other networks. And most importantly, it creates a physical corridor that doesn't rely on the open ocean. The diplomatic groundwork was laid in January 2021 when China and Iran signed what they called a 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership. This wasn't just a trade agreement, it was a geopolitical marriage. The deal, reportedly worth up to $400 billion over its lifespan, covered everything from energy and infrastructure to telecommunications and potential military cooperation. At its core was a straightforward exchange. Iran would provide China with oil at preferential prices, and China would invest in rebuilding Iran's infrastructure, which had deteriorated under decades of international sanctions. Railway construction was explicitly identified as a priority. But building a rail link between China and Iran presented immense challenges. The two countries don't share a border. Between them lie Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan, each with its own political complexities, infrastructure standards, and security concerns. The engineering obstacles were substantial too. Railways in the region use different track gauges, the distance between the rails requiring either standardization or the ability to transfer cargo between different rail systems. The route would cross mountains, deserts, and politically unstable regions. Agreements would need to be negotiated with multiple countries, each with its own interests and relationships with the United States, but slowly, piece by piece, the project came together, building the Iron Link from concept to reality. Between 2021 and 2024, railway officials from China, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Iran held numerous technical discussions. These weren't simply diplomatic meetings. They were detailed engineering sessions focused on solving practical problems. How do you handle the transition between different rail gauges? What standards should govern signaling and safety systems? How can maintenance be coordinated across multiple national railway networks? Who pays for upgrades to existing infrastructure? A crucial milestone came in June 2024, when Iran completed construction of the Rasht-Caspian Sea railway segment. This 164-kilometer stretch was vital because it connected Iran's national railway network to Turkmenistan's system, effectively bridging the gap between Iran and Central Asia. Iranian officials celebrated it as a game-changer, and honestly, they weren't exaggerating. By May 2025, the full China-Iran railway corridor was officially operational. The complete route stretches over 10,000 kilometers, roughly the distance from New York to Singapore, passing through some of the most geopolitically significant territory on Earth. Starting from cities in western China, the railway crosses into Kazakhstan, passes through Turkmenistan, and finally enters Iran, terminating in Tehran, the Iranian capital. The inauguration was significant not just symbolically, but practically. In the first month of operation, a train carrying Chinese-manufactured goods departed from Xi'an, once the starting point of the ancient Silk Road, and arrived at Iran's Apron dry port in just 15 days. At the opening ceremony for Apron's expansion project, this train's arrival was treated as a historic moment, marking the beginning of a new era in Sino-Iranian trade. But the real test came 2 weeks later. The same train, now loaded with approximately 50,000 barrels of Iranian crude oil, made the return journey to China in an identical time frame. This round trip proved the concept. Crude oil could flow from Iran to China entirely by land, without depending on tankers, without passing through maritime choke points, and without any possibility of Western naval interference. Within 6 months, roughly 120,000 tons of Iranian crude had traveled this route. That might not sound like much compared to the millions of barrels that move by sea daily, but it represented something more important than volume. It demonstrated viability. What this means for Iran: breaking free from isolation. To understand why this railway matters so profoundly for Iran, you need to grasp just how resource-rich the country is, and how much those resources have been locked away by sanctions. Iran possesses approximately 157 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, making it the world's fifth largest holder of crude oil. That's roughly 9% of all the oil humanity currently knows how to access. Its natural gas reserves are even more impressive, 34 trillion cubic meters, second only to Russia globally. These resources are concentrated primarily along the Persian Gulf coast and in the southwestern Khuzestan region, where geological conditions are remarkably favorable. Shallow reservoirs, high-quality crude, and relatively easy extraction. In a normal world, Iran would be one of the wealthiest nations on Earth, exporting energy to eager buyers worldwide. But Iran doesn't live in a normal world. It lives in a world shaped by decades of American sanctions. The restrictions began intensifying after Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution and have tightened periodically ever since. particularly after the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. These sanctions specifically target Iran's oil sector, prohibiting most countries from purchasing Iranian crude and blocking Iranian access to the international banking system that facilitates oil transactions. The enforcement mechanism? American control over maritime routes and the dollar-based financial system. Consider what happened in February 2021. The United States seized an Iranian oil tanker off the coast of the United Arab Emirates. That vessel was carrying nearly 2 million barrels of crude oil, worth approximately $110 million at the time. The U.S. government confiscated the oil and eventually sold it, with the proceeds going to a fund for victims of terrorism. From the American perspective, this was law enforcement, punishing sanctions violators. From the Iranian perspective, it was piracy, the seizure of sovereign property in international waters. Or look at April 2023, when the U.S. seized another tanker allegedly transporting crude on behalf of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That ship carried more than 980,000 barrels. Again, the justification was sanctions enforcement. Again, the seizure was possible because the tanker was in waters where American naval power could reach it. These weren't isolated incidents. They represented a pattern. As long as Iranian oil moved by sea through international waters, it remained vulnerable to interdiction by the United States and its allies. For years, Iran adapted through what became known as ghost fleets, older tankers with obscured ownership, often turning off their tracking transponders and engaging in ship-to-ship transfers to mask their origins. Iranian crude found its way to markets, particularly in Asia, through elaborate workarounds. But these methods were expensive, risky, and limited in scale. The China-Iran Railway changes this calculus completely. In 2024, despite all the sanctions and complications, Iran managed to export $67 billion worth of oil, more than half of its total export revenue. And the overwhelming majority of those exports, approximately 89%, went to just one buyer: China. Now, with the railway operational, this trade has an entirely new pathway, one that exists beyond the reach of Western navies. Future Iranian oil shipments to China, and potentially to other Asian markets, can simply bypass the controlled waters altogether. There's no tanker to intercept in the Persian Gulf, no vessel to track through the Strait of Malacca, no maritime choke point where a blockade could be enforced. The oil moves by rail through sovereign territory, crossing borders under bilateral agreements that don't require Western approval. This fundamentally undermines the sanctions regime. When sanctions rely on control of sea lanes, and you remove the sea lanes from the equation, what remains? What this means for China is, well, energy security at last. For China, the strategic value of this railway is equally profound, but for somewhat different reasons. Chinese planners have long been haunted by what they call the Malacca dilemma. Roughly 80% of China's oil imports must pass through the Strait of Malacca, a narrow waterway between Indonesia and Malaysia that's barely 1.5 miles wide at its narrowest point. This geographic bottleneck represents China's Achilles heel. In any serious conflict, especially one involving Taiwan, the United States could theoretically blockade this strait, cutting off the majority of China's energy supplies within days. Chinese cities would face fuel shortages. Factories would slow or stop. The strategic petroleum reserves China has built up would provide a buffer measured in weeks, not months. The economic and social consequences would be catastrophic. China has spent billions trying to reduce this vulnerability. It's built pipelines from Russia and Central Asia. It's invested in alternative maritime routes, including a canal project in Thailand that would bypass the Malacca Strait. It's expanded its navy to better protect its sea lanes. But none of these solutions fully address the core problem: dependence on waterways that others could control. The China-Iran Railway offers something different: a land-based alternative that can't be blockaded by ships. The practical advantages are significant. Previously, Iranian oil tankers needed 30 to 40 days to reach Chinese ports, navigating through multiple choke points and international waters. Rail transport cuts this to just 15 days, a journey half as long. The route isn't affected by monsoons, piracy, or port congestion. It's predictable, schedulable, and reliable in ways that maritime shipping never quite is. More importantly, it's secure. During a crisis, the precise moment when China would most need guaranteed energy supplies, this railway would keep functioning. No foreign navy could stop it without invading sovereign territory, an act of war far more serious than a naval blockade. No sanctions targeting port facilities or shipping companies could interrupt it. It's a supply line that China and Iran control completely, from end to end. Currently, Iran can transport about 600,000 tons of oil monthly through this corridor. China has already announced plans to increase capacity to 1 million tons per month. When that expansion is complete, China will be receiving roughly 12 million tons of Iranian crude annually by rail. Not enough to replace maritime imports, but enough to provide a meaningful alternative channel that diversifies supply routes. And this is just the beginning. The network effect goes well beyond just China and Iran. The true long-term significance of the China-Iran railway lies not in what it is today, but in what it could become tomorrow. Iran already possesses a relatively sophisticated domestic railway network. Unlike some Middle Eastern countries that never invested heavily in rail infrastructure, Iran has maintained and gradually expanded its system over decades. This network connects most major Iranian cities and extends to several of its borders, creating possibilities for further expansion. The railway could potentially link to Turkey, connecting the China-Iran corridor to Europe via Ankara and Istanbul, essentially extending the China-Europe Railway Express, which already connects Chinese cities to European destinations through Central Asia and Russia, southward through a Middle Eastern route. But the direction that carries the most strategic weight is Pakistan. China and Pakistan have long enjoyed close relations, often described as an all-weather friendship. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a flagship project under the Belt and Road Initiative, has already brought billions in Chinese investment to Pakistani infrastructure. But land connectivity between the two countries has always been limited by formidable geography. The Karakoram Mountains, the Tibetan Plateau, and the Himalayas form a natural barrier of breathtaking scale and difficulty. Building railways across such terrain is technically possible but enormously expensive and time-consuming. However, if the route goes through Central Asia to Iran and then southward from Iran into Pakistan, it effectively creates a bypass, a way to reach Pakistan by land without having to conquer the world's most challenging mountain ranges. This isn't merely theoretical. On October 28, 2025, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Pakistan formally signed an agreement to join what's being called the China-Pakistan-Iran Railway Initiative. The stated goal is to achieve full operational status by 2028. Read that date again: 2028, less than 3 years away. The signing ceremony marked an important milestone, the rapid materialization of a land transport network spanning Central Asia, the Middle East, and South Asia. When complete, this system will integrate the economies and resources of China, Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, creating what some analysts are calling a Eurasian heartland corridor. Consider the implications. Pakistan is home to 240 million people. Afghanistan, despite its current challenges, sits at the crossroads of Asia with significant mineral resources. Iran provides energy. China provides manufactured goods, technology, and capital. Together, connected by rail, these countries represent a massive economic bloc operating increasingly outside the Western-dominated system. For China, this network means energy security plus market access. For Iran, it means sanctions-proof export routes. For Pakistan, it means connectivity to the world's second-largest economy without depending on maritime routes that pass through rival India's sphere of influence. For Afghanistan, it offers a potential path toward economic reconstruction after decades of war. The Western response to all this, is one of alarm and, honestly, limited options. From Washington's perspective, the emergence of this railway network represents a serious strategic setback. For decades, American power has rested on several pillars: military superiority, particularly naval dominance, control over the global reserve currency, and influence over international institutions and trade networks. The petrodollar system and the ability to control maritime choke points were not separate elements. They worked together as an integrated system of power projection. When the United States wanted to pressure a country economically, it could impose sanctions knowing that those sanctions would be effective because oil transactions happened in dollars and oil transportation happened through waterways America could monitor or control. The target country might try to evade sanctions, but doing so would be expensive, difficult, and limited in scale. Land-based transportation corridors like the China-Iran Railway threaten to break this system apart. They don't use dollars. Transactions can happen in yuan, reals, or even digital currencies. They don't use sea lanes. There's no Strait of Hormuz or Malacca to patrol. They don't depend on the SWIFT banking system or Western financial institutions. Bilateral agreements and alternative payment systems can handle the transactions. In short, they exist outside the architecture of control that America spent 70 years constructing. The United States has limited options for response. It could impose sanctions on companies involved in building or operating the railway, but such sanctions would have limited effect on Chinese state-owned enterprises that don't depend on access to Western markets. It could provide security assistance to countries along the route to make them more resistant to Chinese influence, but most Central Asian nations are already balancing between multiple powers and welcoming Chinese investment. For this final section, I'm using a classic male transatlantic voice, just as requested. Clean subtitles will accompany my words, and rest assured, we're steering clear of iStock for any supporting materials.